Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Chitran. I am an assistant professor of history from the Vignan's Foundation for Science, Technology and Research. Today, I'll be speaking about Introduction to the Revolt of 1857. The Revolt of 1857 is a very significant event in Indian history. It is a landmark event, I must say, in Indian history. It actually created lots of impacts in determining Indian history and even Indian politics in contemporary times. And for UPSC aspirants, it's very important to have a background about the 1857 revolt. And I think as a history teacher, it's important that we should go beneath the deeper causes that triggered the 1857 revolt. Mostly people discuss about the major cause of the 1857 revolt. There's a need to know more about the deeper causes of the 1857 revolt, and it has been asked in many of the UPSC papers in the previous year questions. So I will start with the presentation. Introduction to 1857 revolt, considered to be an armed conflict, the armed conflict between the sepoys and the English East India Company. It is generally considered to be an anger among the sepoys. The sepoys are basically the Indian soldiers of the British East India Company. As you all know, initially the British East India Company was ruling India. And of course, who were the soldier servants of the British East India Company? Obviously, they relied on Indians. They never hired Englishmen to work for them. Mostly the Indian soldiers had worked for them. They only sustained their military, and they were known as sepoys. So there was a conflict between the English East India Company and the sepoys, and that is why it is also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. So this is how we generally perceive that this is a major conflict between the Indian soldiers of the British East India Company and the British East India Company. The 1857 revolt is basically this major conflict. That is how it's being addressed. And definitely, many of the sepoys or the Indian military men were very much dissatisfied with the English East India Company, and that is why this sparked into a revolt, into a movement. This created lots of anger among the sepoys. And what caused this anger among the sepoys is worthy of investigation. Of course, when we think about the 1857 revolt, it mostly happened in the northern part of India. The 1857 revolt had happened in the northern part of India. It didn't affect the southern part of India. So in the northern part of India, there were many Indian soldiers who were working for the British, and these Indian soldiers were divided into various regiments. So these regiments were called as Bengal Regiment, Bombay Regiment, Madras Regiment. They were divided into various regiments. So the Sepoy Mutiny or the 1857 revolt had mostly affected the Bengal Regiment. It didn't affect the Bombay Regiment or the Madras Regiment. So mostly the soldiers from the Bengal Regiment were very much angry against the English East India Company, and many of these soldiers had come from the higher caste communities. So what were the reasons that triggered this Bengal Regiment to fight against the English East India Company during 1857 is worthy of investigation. And even though it's known as the Bengal Regiment, they were located mostly in northern India, because that was the epicenter of the revolt of 1857. You don't find it happening in many other places. So when we think about 1857 revolt, till now I mentioned that the sepoys or the Indian soldiers were becoming more angry. Yes, Indian soldiers and sepoys were very much angry or dissatisfied with the policies of English East India Company. But one major problem is that when we limit 1857 revolt to just the sepoys, then we are missing out on many other aspects. Actually speaking, there were many other long-standing grievances that other people also had against the English East India Company. Because many of the people think that they just call it a Sepoy Mutiny. Yes, it is a Sepoy Mutiny, the sepoys or the Indian soldiers were very much angry, but then we need to also think about the various other people also who participated. The peasants had participated, the kings had participated, the local elites had participated, the landlords had participated, the zamindars had participated. So it became a collective revolt. Even though the epicenter was in northern India and the triggering factor was among the sepoys or the military men, there were other long-standing grievances that the common people had against the English East India Company, which actually triggered this huge revolt in 1857. And that is why I listed some of the long-standing causes of the revolt. When we think about 1857 revolt, we think that it suddenly became an outburst. Yes, it is an outburst. But then there were other long-standing grievances. Actually, 1857 revolt happened in 1857, but then there were lots of long-standing grievances among the common people, especially in northern India, against the English East India rule. And it started, these long-standing grievances had started from the 1820s or the initial half of the 19th century. And that is why I listed the causes into different terms: the military causes, the political causes, the economic causes, the socio-religious causes, and the cartridge issue, the infamous cartridge issue, which was the major triggering point. So I'll be highlighting the larger causes that actually triggered the 1857 revolt over a long period of time. And the first is the military causes. Of course, when we speak about military, it is the sepoys, as I already mentioned. Yes, military causes. The sepoys, as I told you, were very much angry against the British East India Company, especially in northern India. Why were they so much angry against the English East India Company? Of course, they were serving the English East India Company. But then, what were they paid? Payment is very important. Their payments were reduced by the English East India Company. Till 1820s, the English East India Company never interfered among the military men, among the Indian military men. They never interfered. But from the 1820s, we see the English East India Company increasingly interfering among the Indian military men or the sepoys. And its reflections were mostly seen through the reduction of the salaries. Their salaries were reduced, their allowances were reduced. These are the basic rights of Indian sepoys. And the Indian sepoys are rooted to the ground. They expect huge salaries, they expect decent salaries, dignified payment, and they were dissatisfied with the payment of the salary. Not just that, their caste sentiments were also affected. As I mentioned in the initial slides, many of these sepoys came from higher castes. And the higher castes had lots of belief systems, traditions, and customs. So their salaries were cut, their allowances were cut. Along with that, their caste sentiments were affected. How their caste sentiment was affected? As I told you, many of these sepoys came from higher castes. And these higher castes had a belief system that if they go beyond the sea, their traditions would be affected. Because inherently, they are supposed to consume vegetarian food. And if they cross the seas, there was this belief that they would be exposed to pollution, the idea of purity and pollution. So among the higher castes, it was forbidden to cross the seas. So after 1820s, the English East India Company had told the Indian military soldiers, especially in the northern region, that you are supposed to go to other countries, because that was also the time when Britain was expanding its imperial ambitions. They were expanding to Burma, they were expanding to other parts of South Asia. So for that purpose, they needed Indian sepoys. And to expand their territories, they obviously need Indian soldiers. And many of these Indian soldiers are coming from higher castes. And if they cross the seas, then their religious sentiments would be affected. So they were angry. Why are they interfering in our day-to-day life? That's what Indian soldiers were thinking. So the pay cut, the allowances were cut, and their religious sentiments or caste sentiments were affected. This created that frustration or anger among the Indian sepoys. And these will come under the military causes. One more point that I forgot to mention is the fear of conversion to Christianity. They were thinking that the Englishmen are trying to convert them to Christianity. because they were not respecting the belief systems of the high caste Hindus. Till 1820s they had never interfered, but after 1820s they are interfering in their religious matters. They were thinking in that way, and they were having this fear that English East India Company would convert them to Christianity. So we discussed about the military causes. As I told you, we shouldn't limit 1857 revolt to just the Sepoy mutiny. It was a larger movement. It started with the Sepoys and it diversified into many other sections or many other groups. There were also the long-standing economic causes. As I mentioned, this revolt became a collective revolt, a collective response to various factors. So along with military causes, there are these economic causes. We have discussed about the idea of deindustrialization. Of course, much later you see the nationalist leader Dadabhai Naoroji coining the term deindustrialization. The English East India Company were trying to deindustrialize India. They wanted to shut down most of the Indian handicrafts. They wanted to sell their products. They wanted to promote their products. And you see that the English East India Company were trying to promote their products, their finished products to India, which would be sold very well, through which the Indian industries would decline. So many of the Indian industrialists or common Indian industrialists were very much dissatisfied. Not just that, the Indian products which were sold to other countries or Britain, tariffs, huge tariffs were imposed on the Indian products. So what will happen? Indian products won't get sold. Indians have to pay high tariffs. So deindustrialization, high tariffs on Indian products, and of course the heavy taxation. Of course, there are these very infamous revenue settlements that were introduced by the English East India Company. The permanent settlement, which was very infamous. The English East India Company had imposed heavy taxation on Indians, and that is why there was a collective anger. So deindustrialization, heavy tariffs on Indian products, and heavy revenue assessment. So it is not just military causes, there were certain economic causes also. Military causes, economic causes, and then political causes. We see that many of the kings, many of the nobles, many of the elites had participated in this revolt of 1857. There are the very famous people of Rani Jhansi Lakshmi Bai, Nana Sahib, Tantia Tope, so many people. They were basically chieftains, ruling chieftains. So Sepoy mutiny is not just Sepoy mutiny, it was a collective revolt. And there were these political causes, so military causes, economic causes, and the political causes. One of the most important political cause which is related to 1857 revolt is the annexation of Awadh or Oudh. So Awadh or Oudh is actually located in Uttar Pradesh. This is a map of Awadh or Oudh. Oudh is a term that the British actually coined. It is located in Uttar Pradesh. It is located in modern day Uttar Pradesh. That time it was called United Provinces. The present day states of Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, the present day states of Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand will fall under United Provinces. So this Awadh was located in the United Provinces or the present day Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand. So in Awadh, there was an outburst of revolt against the English East India Company. Why there was an outburst in Awadh? What we see is that in Awadh, certain land revenue settlements were being imposed by the English East India Company. And many of the peasants in Awadh were affected by this land revenue settlement. Not just that, many of the sepoys or the military men came from peasant families. So you see that the distinction between sepoy and peasant was not there. So it was mentioned that the sepoy is basically the peasant in uniform. So basically these peasants are being converted to sepoys. And the English East India Company are bringing so many land revenue settlements in Awadh, and many of these peasants are being affected by these land revenue peasant settlements. Coupled with that, these peasants are recruited as sepoys. So there will be obvious frustration against the English East India Company. Not just that, there was a person known as Wajid Ali Shah. He is considered to be the Nawab of Awadh. So he was accused of misgovernance. What is misgovernance? Misgovernance means that he was accused, he was the local king of that region. He was accused of not ruling properly, not ruling in an efficient way. He was accused of being corrupt, and that was the means through which English East India Company leveled charges against him, and they wanted to acquire that territory. So many of the common people who were peasants, come sepoys, they were dissatisfied with the English East India Company, because English East India Company was thinking to push out Nawab Wajid Ali Shah and acquire that territory. So the peasants come sepoys were dissatisfied with the land revenue settlement. Along with that, the deportation of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah due to misgovernance became a source of anger among the peasants. The peasants were frustrated. The peasants come sepoys were frustrated, and that is why Awadh became a major area of revolt in 1857. And the infamous Governor General during that time was Lord Dalhousie. His full name is James Andrew Brown Ramsay, 1st Marquess of Dalhousie. And the Chief Commissioner who acted to acquire Awadh was James Outram. So there was lots of resistance against these two people, because they were the agents who actually wanted to annex Awadh or control Awadh. Almost 75,000 members were recruited as sepoys, and as I told you, many of these sepoys came from peasant families. So they felt that they were being betrayed. These peasants come sepoys are being felt that they were being betrayed by both these people, and as a result you see them getting angry and protesting against the English East India Company. And you see that a group called the Talukdars, who are basically the landed communities or the landed intermediaries, their lands were also taken away by the English East India Company. So there was the political annexation and the economic annexation of Awadh, which kind of triggered this anger among the peasants as well as the landed communities who are known as Talukdars. They also became angry, and it became a collective protest, especially in the region of Awadh. So I mentioned the military causes, the economic causes, the political cause which is related to the annexation of Awadh. But then not all regions protested against English East India Company, because there were regions, other regions in northern India which actually became loyal to English East India Company. Awadh was a major region which resisted, but then there were other regions where the economic policies of the English colonial state or the East India Company didn't affect the common people. So there were no outbursts or anger in those regions. Awadh became a major source of anger or resistance. This is a map of Awadh. Another major political reason for the revolt of 1857 is the doctrine of lapse, the very infamous doctrine of lapse, which was also introduced by the infamous Lord Dalhousie. What is doctrine of lapse? Doctrine of lapse is nothing but there will be so many territories, there will be so many princely states in India. If these princely states didn't have any natural sons, usually kings would be ruling, and they would be their sons who would become the next kings after the death of their fathers. If there are no natural sons or natural princesses, and if they have adopted sons, these lands would be acquired by the English East India Company. So this was also a move to expand their territory. The annexation of Awadh and doctrine of lapse are very significant, because what we see before 1857 is that many of the Indian territories were acquired through doctrine of lapse. The territories where there were no natural sons and had adopted sons, these territories were acquired by English East India Company under Lord Dalhousie. And that is why we see that in these regions, there were lots of protests during 1857. It culminated into a collective protest. So the territories that were annexed by the English East India Company on the grounds of doctrine of lapse were Satara 1848, Nagpur, Sambalpur, Bhagat in 1850, Udaipur 1852, Jhansi, where the famous Rani Lakshmi Bai had revolted in 1853. So you see that the kings, the chieftains, the local elites, the peasants, the sepoys, all of them joined together to fight against the English East India Company. So it is not just a sepoy mutiny, it is much more than that, because you see lots of other agents also protesting against the English East India Company, and that is why this revolt of 1857 is a very significant event in Indian history. Even for any student of modern history or any student who is studying UPSC, it is very significant. But there were other regions that actually didn't revolt, because you see that regions such as Indore, Gwalior, Saugar and Rajasthan, these regions were not annexed because they might have had natural sons. They might not have had adopted sons. So these regions were not annexed by the English East India Company. The regions that were annexed by the English East India Company on the grounds of not having natural sons, those regions only protested against the English East India Company during 1857. And because of these regions such as Indore, Gwalior, Saugar, Rajasthan, they were very much loyal to the English East India Company. That shows that the 1857 revolt was not a unified revolt. We'll discuss about the concepts of unity and division in our next videos. So these were the territories. This is a map of India. These were the territories that were annexed by the English East India Company. So it's being mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is Satara. So Satara is in Maharashtra, which was annexed by English East India Company on grounds of doctrine of lapse. Jaitpur in northern India, 1849 this was annexed. Then there was Sambalpur, which is in present day Odisha, which was annexed by English East India Company on doctrine of lapse. Udaipur, Jhansi, Nagpur in present day Maharashtra. So this is a map which contains, so it mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These are the regions which were annexed by the English East India Company on grounds of doctrine of lapse. It is also mentioned here, Satara, Jaitpur, Sambalpur, Udaipur, Jhansi, Nagpur. Military causes, economic causes, political causes. Next is socio-cultural causes. So North Indians were not very much satisfied with the rule of the English East India Company on the grounds that during 1820s and 1830s, the English East India Company, because of the Charter Act and all these aspects, they were trying to implement certain socio-educational reform movements. English education was being introduced, sati was being abolished, widow remarriage was being encouraged or adopted. People like Macaulay and Bentinck were agents to that. There was this socio-religious reform movements that were engendered by the English East India Company. The sati was abolished. The practice of sati, as you know, was a very evil practice where Hindu women were supposed to jump on the funeral pyre of their husbands. So this evil practice was abolished by the English East India Company. Women's education were encouraged, which was prohibited among the upper caste Hindu families. Widow remarriage was encouraged, which was also prohibited among the upper caste Hindus. So what happened is the Indians, especially northern India, feeling, especially Indian men, also Indian women, they're feeling that their religious sentiments or their socio-cultural sentiments were being affected by the English East India Company. They were interfering too much in our day-to-day life, be it economically, be it militarily, be it politically, be it culturally. So this is why that anger erupted into a huge movement. And that is why you see that even the mosques and temples, temple lands, mosque and temple lands were very much autonomous. Taxation was being imposed on mosque and temple lands. So they were thinking that some alien ruler from England who wants to convert them to Christianity is trying to intervene in our day-to-day life, be it economically, be it socially, be it culturally, be it politically, be it militarily. And who are these people? We should resist against them. And that is how this 1857 revolt had happened. Another infamous incident. What was the triggering point of the revolt? These were the long-standing grievances of the people against English. But what was that triggering point that actually facilitated this huge revolt? Was the cartridge issue. It started with the sepoys. The revolt of 1857 started with the sepoys and it spread to other parts of northern India. Common people also started participating, peasants started participating. It became a huge outcry against the English East India Company. Immediate cause, the immediate triggering point is the cartridge issue. Sepoys, the Indian sepoys were supposed to pull the cartridge out of the gun before shooting. A rumor started circulating that in the cartridge, the English East India Company deliberately stuffed cow fat and pig fat. Cow is considered to be a holy mother according to Hindus, and pig is considered with contempt by the Muslims. And you see that Muslims and Hindus were there among the Indian soldiers. It is not just that upper caste Hindus were there were Muslims also, because Muslims are inherently part of Indian subcontinent, and many peasants also were Muslims who turned out to be sepoys. So there was a fear that circulated among the sepoys. It was a rumor, it is considered to be a rumor. There's no official confirmation that they actually stuffed cow and pig fat in the cartridges. So these Hindu and Muslim sepoys, they feared that their religious sentiments are getting affected because the English East India Company, in order to convert them to Christianity and in order to affect their religious beliefs, they had stuffed cow fat and pig fat in the cartridges. This created anger among the sepoys and they started revolting against the English East India Company. In the next video session, I outlined the causes of the revolt of 1857. That is why it was titled Introduction to 1857, because we need to know the background, the larger background of the 1857 revolt. Rather than seeing it as just the Sepoy mutiny, it was a collective movement. That is why I highlighted the military, the political, the economic and the socio-cultural causes. As UPSC students, you should be able to know about these larger causes rather than seeing it as only Sepoy mutiny. And in the next video session, I'll be mostly speaking about the course of the mutiny, how this mutiny spanned out, where did it happen, how it happened, and who are the agents who participated, who are the major leaders who participated, what is the course of the mutiny. Before that, I'll just detail some previous year question papers that is very much connected to the causes of the revolt of 1857. The first question which came in the GS paper in 2019 is that the revolt of 1857 was a cumulative effect of the character and policies of colonial rule in India examined. So this came in UPSC, the long-standing causes of the 1857 revolt had come in one of the UPSC papers in 2019, which is a GS paper, General Studies paper. There was another question which came in 2000 in prelims, which is an objective type question, an MCQ, which actually speaks about the last major extension of British Indian territory took place during the time of A. Dufferin, B. Dalhousie, C. Lytton, D. Curzon, and the answer is Dalhousie. Dalhousie is significant in 1857 revolt because the last major extension of British East India Company is happening during the time of Dalhousie, and this is actually triggering the 1857 revolt. So it is very much connected to the cause of the 1857 revolt. One more question is there. This also came in UPSC mains examination in the history optional paper during 2020. For long, the revolt of 1857 has been mistaken to be a mere mutiny of the Indian sepoys in the Bengal army. However, its causes need to be searched for not only in the dissatisfaction of the army, but in a long drawn process of fundamental social and economic change that upset the peasant communities. So this particular question shows that when we think about the 1857 revolt, we should know the larger causes, the long-standing grievances that the common people had accumulated against the English East India Company. It is very significant because it has come in the UPSC paper, and that is why I spoke about the larger causes of the revolt of 1857, which will come under the introduction to 1857 revolt. In the next video session, I'll be speaking about the course of the mutiny. As I told you, who were the agents, how it happened, where it happened, what was the actual course, who are the people who got affected due to this revolt, who are the people who died during this revolt. So the actual agents, the localities where it happened, all these will be detailed in the next video session. Thank you for your attention.